what we didn't address as much was the role that movement and exercise plays in mental health. And I find that fascinating because if you were to go on to PubMed or to go on to really any research database and begin to look at modifiable behaviors that can significantly move the needle in terms of mental well-being, at the very top of the list, above psychotherapy, above nutrition, above just about everything. There's only one other competing thing that I'll talk about here in a second that's pretty on par with this one, is exercise. Exercise constantly comes up.
Hello, my friend, and welcome to Something for Everybody. My name is Aaron Machbitz. Dr. J, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Before we get into the meat and bones of all the good stuff that we're going to talk about today, I have a very important question to ask you, and it is, how are you doing? Like actually, how are you doing?
Yeah, it's always an interesting question. I saw a podcast one time where Jordan Peterson was asked that question, and he thought about it and just started like bawling, crying. And that's not a spoiler saying that's about to happen here. But how am I actually doing? A bit overwhelmed. I mean, I'm the co-founder and chief scientific officer of a digital mental health company, and it's a startup. So it's always a matter of fighting every single day. We're in the business of helping people with regulating their stress response, but I'd be lying if I told you that I wasn't feeling some stress the past few weeks. I surely have.
How do you handle the overwhelm? Because for me, that's a pretty reoccurring emotion as well.
Yeah.
Also running sort of my own businesses and trying to get a podcast off the ground, and just like life can be overwhelming sometimes. How do you handle it?
There's a lot of things that I do to handle my emotional health, but I think the number one thing is by not avoiding it. So many people, I think they avoid the discomfort of stress, anxiety, emotional dysregulation. And when you avoid it, it's almost like you try to protect yourself by telling yourself that it's just going to go away. Like it'll just find its way kind of out the window if I just tuck it away. And that's just not the case. These things compound. And as these things compound, people either led down one of two paths. We either explode or we implode. And for me, it is a matter of learning to accept the experience of stress, leveraging stress for my advantage as opposed to viewing it as a pitfall or a downfall or some sort of barrier. So for me, I'm always thinking about how can I just be mindful of this moment and this experience, not accepting in terms of like, I will always be this way, like things will never get better, but acceptance of the actual emotion that I'm experiencing, whether it's stress or anxiety or sadness or frustration. So I think it's learning to be in the moment, but it's also like just taking care of myself in the best way I possibly can, like making sure that my exercise is on point, my nutrition's on point. I'm doing what I can to practice good stress mitigation skills, that my relationships are intact and not toxic, making sure that I'm sleeping well and I'm getting good rest. It's a combination of all of those things, which I know is a bit widespread, but all of it matters. And if we want to live a life of more contentment and joy, I think it makes sense to put in the hard work in those areas.
I agree 100%. And that was one of the big things that I wanted to talk to you about. I was looking at your Instagram, which everyone should go and follow. It's linked in the show notes. And you had a post about your four pillars of mental health. Mm-hmm. And that struck a chord with me, because when I'm talking about this stuff, I'm like, just eat well, move well, sleep well, and think well. And basically your four pillars encompass all of those things, obviously, because those are the tenets of how you live a good life. And before we get to those, it's like, I think one of the problems today is that we want this like sort of quick hack fix thing. And a lot of stuff you see on social media is like, if you do this thing for 3 days, you're going to be fixed or cured, or those words are kind of weird and they don't make sense, but mental health is a lifelong journey, as you know, obviously. And so Um, I love the fact that that's something that you're talking about as someone who is an expert in this area. And so I would love to, with you right now, just sort of break down those 4 pillars, one by one, and what you have to offer, tips, how people can get started if they're not doing that thing. So the first one being routine exercise.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I think that drew me to this, so I've always been an athlete, but what I noticed is that I'm a psychologist by training, but during my training in psychology, most of the focus was on diagnostics and assessment and then therapeutics. But therapeutics was more like, we can call it conventional psychotherapy. So people may be familiar with things like cognitive behavioral therapy or dialectical behavioral therapy or ACT. There's a lot of different modalities for that. What we didn't address as much was the role that movement and exercise plays in mental health. And I find that fascinating because if you were to go on to PubMed or to go on to really any research database and begin to look at modifiable behaviors that can significantly move the needle in terms of mental well-being, at the very top of the list, above psychotherapy, above nutrition, above just about everything. There's only one other competing thing that I'll talk about here in a second that's pretty on par with this one, is exercise. Exercise constantly comes up. Why is that? Well, we know that movement of the body is training in the brain. So as we move the body, and that could be strength training, that could be cardiovascular training, as we engage in mobilizing energy, we know that this stimulates our central nervous system, so our brain and our spinal cord, to help to build more neuronal connections, to help with what's called neurogenesis, which is the neuronal connections. And then also it creates and stimulates something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor, which is like miracle grow for the brain. All of these things can be so helpful also in balancing some of the neurotransmitters that are associated with emotional and mental dysregulation. And I don't think that neurotransmitters are just the core of mental illness and mental wellness. However, we do know that they are a variable. So we know that we can enhance their functionality with movement and with exercise. So as a part of the routine that I provide as a clinician, that we kind of teach with my company at Hanu, is that exercise has to be a foundational pillar to what you're doing, because the evidence is just so robust as to how exercise plays a vital role in overall mental well-being.
Yeah, like why do you think it's taken so long for that to be like, maybe I'm wrong, but maybe I feel like it's taken a long time for the movement, the exercise and the body to become interconnected with the mind piece. I think for a long time, maybe people only thought psychological distress happened in the brain and you fix the mind with the mind. Um, and I just, for me personally, that's just never been the case. Like every time I feel anxious or stressed, it's always been an exercise, because I've been an athlete my whole life, like you. So that's always been like sort of my foundational piece.
Right.
Um, and now it's like, for me, it just feels like there's no other option. You just have to move. You have
Yeah.
to.
Yeah.
Like otherwise life is just not as good as it potentially might be. And I think people also get caught up on like, oh, do I have to lift weights? No, you absolutely don't have to lift weights. You should,
Mhm.
because that's a great marker for health span.
Mhm.
But you can do Zumba or dance or rock climb or do jujitsu or all of these things. You just got to find something that you actually want to stick to and that you enjoy doing, even though it sometimes sucks.
Right. Any movement is better than no movement for sure. I would, to come back to your question, I think one of the primary reasons it took so long is because of what you mentioned before. People were in camps, and scientists and academics are the ones. So if people aren't familiar with with how this works, is that academics drive the research that informs the therapy provided by the clinician.
Mm.
And because of that, clinicians are waiting to hear from the researchers as to what to do in order to move the needle. So in our discussion in mental health, we're talking about how do we move the needle from a mental health perspective. If we're waiting on these researchers, we're typically looking for people who are doing research in that field. So for exercise physiologists, they're looking to exercise physiologists. For psychologists, they're looking for psychological researchers. And so a lot of the times, especially in the fields of psychological research and mental health research, a lot of it had to do with different therapeutic modalities or different theoretical models. And we weren't really looking at health behavior change. When we knew that when someone was depressed or anxious, they were much less likely to exercise. We knew that they were much less likely to make appropriate nutritional decisions. We know that they were likely having sleep-related issues. So we kind of always looked back like prospectively or retrospectively. And what we needed to do is look forward and say, okay, well, how can we actually use some of these tools preventatively? And so it wasn't until I would say more or less like the last like 20 or so years that we really came into this idea that, okay, the mind and the body are not two completely disconnected entities here, right? Like these are actually much more interconnected. They're a bidirectional street. Once one communicates one way, the other can communicate the other way as well. So it's two-way communication. I think that for psychologists, there was this resistance to saying, and I put mental health into psychologists as well. I am a psychologist, so I kind of speak for the masses of psychologists, which I probably shouldn't, but I'm going to anyway. What I would say for us is we're like, okay, well, we're trained in this modality. That is the lens that we view this from. It is our life's work to engage in the activities that we've been trained in. And so we kind of avoided looking into these other pathways. And then I think we had this kind of clear knock at the door saying like, well, what is the actual thing that we're trying to do as mental health professionals? Oh yeah, help people improve mental well-being. If that is the case, and that is the platform that we're running on, then shouldn't we not leave any stone unturned here? Like we should explore everything. And I think the openness to holistic and integrative medicine and integrative health has been the key driver and catalyst to having us look at these other approaches like nutrition and exercise and sleep and how they are interconnected with mental well-being and how the mind and the body are not just these two completely separated entities.
Yeah, exactly. Speaking of that, was that a driver for you to create your own business?
It was. It's funny. I kind of came into this business almost out of chance, stars aligning. It was kind of a weird story in the sense that I was running my own practice, had a really just, I guess, well-performing consulting firm. And then I was approached by a technologist who I was consulting for, who worked in the Silicon Valley area. Who's like, I think we could do something better. Like, let's put together something in the digital mental health space that's better than what's out there. And I had to take that leap of faith. And I said, you know what? Yeah, I think that some of the work that I'm doing right now that's helping people on a small scale, individually, maybe in small groups, is working effectively. I think we can reach a lot more people if we create a digital mental health platform, a software platform. So yeah, I think it was a primary driver. And then it's also too just trying to open people's eyes to how making even small behavioral changes in their lifestyle can really move the needle. We don't have to boil the ocean here. It's not like I need you doing marathon training and, eating, only ice cubes and spinach and chard. Like I think a lot of people are like, oh, it's got to be so restrictive. No, there's a lot of ways of doing this that can move the needle significantly, but doesn't require you just to kind of revamp, everything that you're doing in your life.
Yeah. I mean, that's sort of a consequence of our kind of extremist culture, that surrounds mostly social media, right? If you're not doing this, if you're not waking up at 5 a.m. and doing the cold shower, and then by 6:30 you've already done 90 minutes of work, and then you've sent 42 emails, and you've touched base with 900 clients, and then you have this passion, and you turn it into a side hustle, and the side hustle is It's like, holy fucking, all right, man.
Right. Exactly.
I can't just wake up, have a little breakfast, maybe have my coffee, pack my kids' lunch, drive them to school, have a nice day at work. And then inside of all of that, get some movement in. So eat right 80% of the time.
Sure.
Find a place to be grateful for something. Maybe go outside with my kids so I can get in touch with there's ways to like live life to its fullest without having a sort of, regimented idea. But I guess if you're
Yeah.
so far off and you need to be drawn back in and your life really needs you really need help, like you're really struggling, then maybe yes, you need to get pretty strict with your routine so you can get that down. Then I feel like over time, then you can start to loosen that up because become this person. You become a transformed person that does the thing they say they're going to do. They have some protocols in place and all of that stuff. So
Right.
yeah, there could be some differing views there potentially.
Yeah. 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 No, I'm with you. Yeah.
Okay, so number two, touched on it a little bit, but good nutrition, like huge. How does our nutrition affect everything that we do?
Yeah. Yeah. The one thing that every human has to do is we have to eat and we have to drink. Like that is a given if you are a human being. And so if we think of what food actually is, food is a messenger. It's a communicator. And we use food to communicate with our body, to communicate with our cells, at a very small scale, but also very large scale, all in one. What we put into our body uh, doesn't just drive us from a metabolic standpoint to keep our body going or an energetic standpoint. That is true that it does that, but also it drives neuronal functioning or drives brain functioning. We know that as people experience difficulties with emotional or mental health, it affects typically behaviors towards eating. And as our eating behaviors change, it can also affect people's sorry, I lost track of what I was saying there. And as people make changes in their, so as people make changes in their diet, it affects their mental well-being. And as people's mental well-being changes, it affects their diet. Nutrition is extremely important because, again, it is going to be the messenger. And when that messenger is providing a message to the cells to fire or not fire, to under or overperform, then these directly relate to overall mental outcomes. And so I would say that nutrition is, especially from a metabolic standpoint, blood glucose management, mitochondrial functioning standpoint, nutrition would be at the core alongside exercise, sleep, and the other things that I mentioned as areas that are modifiable behaviors that have been demonstrated well within the evidence of literature to actually move the needle on mental functioning. So I think that people, they underestimate how food can affect overall mental functioning and well-being. And I would say that we know in so many different ways that if you were to underestimate that fact, like you're going to leave a lot of your cards on the table. So yeah, nutrition at the core of mental well-being.
Do you have any like basic tenets that you tell people to try and focus on when they're thinking about altering what foods they eat?
Yeah. So the biggest thing would be overly processed foods and how they can affect cellular functioning. So for the most part, it would be foods that are overly saturated with sugar, and how sugar can dysregulate blood glucose. Blood glucose dysregulates cortisol output, epinephrine, norepinephrine output. So these are stress hormones and stress neurotransmitters. If those are constantly being dysregulated through the inclusion of overly processed foods, well, that can inhibit and affect mood pretty significantly. So we don't want a roller coaster of blood glucose throughout the day, because we know that can significantly impact a lot of these mood hormones and mood-related neurotransmitters. The other thing that's really, really important is the role it plays in inflammation, and how we know that inflammation, both the mind or brain and in the body as well, are significantly impacted by what we eat, whether that's overly processed foods, it's inflammatory oils, it's foods that just kind of aren't. Another one would be overconsumption of foods as well, can generally impact mood. So there's so many robust studies out there that demonstrate kind of the impact that blood sugar regulation, or I should say fluctuation, as well as compacted with things like eating a highly processed oils or refined seed oils, these things we know drive inflammation, and inflammation in the mind and body affects mood in general. So those are the kind of the core tenets that I tell people to watch out for, is like overconsumption of food in general, but that's a little bit too basic. I think kind of watching out for protein intake is another one. So we know that enhanced protein intake also helps with muscle protein synthesis. So it helps you build bigger, faster, stronger muscles. But the other thing that it does really effectively is that it builds neurotransmitters. So proteins or amino acids are the building blocks of neurotransmitters within the brain. So without the intake of high quality protein, we affect the manufacturing and production of these neurotransmitters in the brain as well.
What is your stance on alcohol? Because that's an interesting topic nowadays as well.
Alcohol, there is no defined evidence that there is benefit for any level of consumption of alcohol. There is no evidence that we see right now in the literature that any consumption of alcohol is beneficial to health, especially for mental well-being. Does that mean that people need to stay away from it all the time? No. For some people, like, it can be really fun for them just to have a glass or two of wine on the weekends, with their family or with their friends. I'm not advocating that everybody get rid of wine. What I am advocating for is for us to stop perpetuating the false narrative that alcohol is somehow a health chemical, because it's not. We just don't have the evidence for that. For many people, what may be effective coping by the use of alcohol initially turns into maladaptive coping. And I've seen many individuals as a clinician who start off by saying, it really just helps me to de-stress with one or two drinks. Well, fine. But then it becomes, and they do it once a week. And then it becomes, twice a week. And then it becomes every day of the week. And then it becomes, well, I need like 4 or 5 now. And then the next thing we know, we have a full-blown alcohol use disorder or addiction. That's not an uncommon story to hear. So I think that while I don't want to ultimately demonize alcohol, I do want to say that it's a chemical that, and I would even go as far as to say a toxin that we need to be highly judicious and careful with. It's not saying we should never use it and that there's never fun, appropriate times to use it, but we have to know thyself, number one. And then number two, identify that this should not be the only quote unquote effective coping strategy that people use when dealing with stress or mental health related issues.
Yes. The most interesting quote I heard about alcohol is the only drug on the planet that if you don't use it, people assume you have a problem.
Yep. I agree. Period. Yeah. I think that sums it up right there, which is really interesting to me. And it's really interesting to me too, not to go off on too much of a tangent, but in some of today's day and culture, I've seen where we can glorify the use and overuse of alcohol. Expecting, certain comedians to like be that guy who drinks and gets plastered. And that's kind of like his branding and icon. And I'm not mentioning anybody in particular, but I see kind of this wave of like glorifying kind of the use and I would say overuse of it. And it's interesting. I'm not sure if I fully understand it, especially as a clinician. I get it for a quote unquote branding type thing, but I don't understand it as a clinician because I think we start to go down a very slippery slope when we use that as a primary mechanism for whatever it may be, branding or coping or whatever it is. So yeah, alcohol's a tricky one.
Yeah, I was listening to a podcast, and the podcaster was talking about how the podcaster built this sort of career off being like this crazy sort of drunk, but that was sort of a performance that podcaster was putting on, and every time they went to like a party with real people or around fans, they were expected to be this person where they heard all of these stories about how they drank all this stuff and performed in this way and did all these things that were interesting stories later on. And so it's like you can get caught up in that trap as well, because you want to, sort of, I guess, be loyal to your fan base and they expect something from you. And so you want to give to them how much potentially they've given you. And then it becomes a performance rather than who you really are. And then that becomes a deep trap, which I know very well. And yeah, it's tough. It's very tough because I stopped drinking probably like over 400 days ago.
Hmm.
And the first couple times I like went out with some of my friends and told them I wasn't drinking anymore, the look you get, my friend, is like,
I
and they
know.
know me. And they know me. They know I, one, didn't have a problem. I just decided to stop. And they still looked at me like, oh, did he secretly have one? Was he
Yeah.
like putting vodka in his water bottle and then going to work? Is that the person he was? I don't know now. And it's so interesting. Like, it's like, and so I hope that we can shift away from that culture and shift into a culture where alcohol is just something that, like, yeah, I like to have a whiskey with my buddy after work. And then we go home and we feel fresher and clearer to do whatever we're going to do. Or, having a cheers at a wedding, or, I'm Jewish, so having wine at some of our religious events is like a part of our culture. And
Yeah.
so,
Yep.
but all in moderation and with an intention, right? I think things like that can be happen with intention, like getting on social media with an intention. It
Right.
all helps these somewhat dangerous things just be a little bit more productive for our lives. But yeah.
Yeah. No, and I agree with you as well. Kind of coming back to the statement that I make that I don't want to demonize alcohol, because I think that's taking it a little bit too far. But it's like finding that balance. It's like not demonizing alcohol, not glorifying it as well as being kind of like, oh, it's the elixir that we all need to be social or to be whatever, fill in the blank. It's just like knowing thyself as well, right? And then just respecting the decisions of others. That's kind of key to this.
Yeah. And it falls into the third pillar, which is stress resiliency, which is, I think, is what we need a lot of right
Yeah.
now, how to figure out how to deal with our stress. So what are your core tenets there?
Yes, people I think intuitively understand that they are stressed, but readily admitting it to themselves or to anyone else can be very challenging, because we are in a culture and society, especially here domestically in America, where you push it. Like you just push, push, push. Like you'll sleep when you're dead. Like it is hardcore. Like you work, work, work. And, if you're feeling stressed, suck it up. Like rub some dirt on it. Like you got to go. And it's interesting because we expect, like within our society, that leads to better performance. But what we know is that that's not true, actually. We can burn ourselves out, and we do burn ourselves out really, really quickly. Because what I tell people is that stress also gets a bad rep. Stress is inherently good. And I will preach that until I am proven otherwise. Stress at its core is inherently good. Well, why is that? Stress is nothing but an alert system. It's a protective mechanism. We have stress monitoring and stress engagement mechanisms in our body in order to self-preserve, in order to protect. Without the stress response, we would probably, number one, never get anything done. And number two, put ourselves into situations that will get us killed pretty easily. So evolutionarily, like we can't really continue to pass down these genes if we don't have effective stress responses. If I am out in the woods and I'm hiking and a mountain lion, or let's say a bear, jumps around the corner, I sure as hell better have my stress response turn on and kick into high gear. Because if my stress response does not in that time, my ass is grass. Like I'm done. So what I would say is that stress is doing its job and it's doing it effectively. What I want to have happen is once I'm out of that situation and I'm, back up in my car ready to drive home, I might be a little bit shaken, but my stress response should be turned down, if not turned off at that point in time. That's how stress works. We want it to go on and turn off at will when we need it, not on when we don't need it. Where stress can impact us negatively and where stress is not good is when that knob gets turned on and it stays on. What we might refer to as chronic stress. Chronic stress, that is the stress that is bad for you. That is not good. When we are in an acute stress situation, like the example I gave just a minute ago, the mountain lion jumps around the corner, We need our heart rate to significantly increase. We need blood flow to pump all to the body. We need our cognition to focus solely on one task, which is survival. We need all of that to happen in that moment to self-preserve. But outside of that, we don't need that to be happening. We actually know that can be very harmful to us physiologically. A short burst of it, and who cares? It's actually great. It helps us out. Long burst of it, not so good. That's going to wear us out. That's going to drain our adrenals. That's going to dysregulate our blood glucose significantly, dysregulate cortisol significantly. So what we're really concerned here is identifying the nature and the triggers of chronic stress as opposed to transient stress. But when we're in a constant state of stress due to work or relationships or financial struggles or whatever it may be, that's the type of stress that we need to learn to mitigate. And so what do? Well, if we boil it down to nervous system regulation, which is basically like, is my stress response being overly activated? Then we have to say, well, how can we train the nervous system to not overly be activated? How can we train ourselves to learn how to become more self-aware as to what and when we are stressed, and then also learn how to self-regulate, train the nervous system to become more resilient, to regulate with our own volition at will. And this is where I bring in a lot of things like heart rate variability training or biofeedback, where I do things like meditation or mindfulness training, non-sleep deep rest protocols. This is where psychotherapy can be really effective as well. It's just making sure that we are armed with as many tools as we possibly can to self-regulate. I think that's what it comes down to, is learning to self-regulate. And so these are things that if we aren't doing, like, we must do. And I think that stress, as opposed to exercise, nutrition, sleep, stress tends to be one that just isn't as sexy for people to work on, right? So it's like, oh, exercise, I can do this new routine or buy this new equipment. Nutrition, it's like, oh, I can, try this new fad diet or whatever it may be. And then it's like, for sleep, it's like, I can buy all the new, biohacking sleep gear. For stress, it's kind of like, oh man, I actually got to put in the hard work. Like, I've got to, do this, this, and this. It's a challenging one for a lot of people. But I think that if they leave it unattended, it is a pillar that, if left unattended, will cause the whole house to fall down. And so if you want to build foundational health, then stress resiliency is got to be like one of the, if not the core focus.
How does dysfunctional breathing relate to our increase in stress, or how we deal with it, at least?
We are constantly breathing, and we are meant to do so naturally. As human beings, that's how we're designed. However, as we experience the chronic stress that I mentioned before, it inherently changes the way that we breathe. Well, why does it do that? Well, when we're in a stressful situation, we don't want to breathe like someone who's relaxed. We don't want to breathe slow. We don't want to breathe deep. And we don't want to breathe with good intention. So when we are stressed, that means that we shift our breathing from lower to higher up in the chest. We tend to breathe a lot more from the mouth. And then we also tend to breathe in a very rapid manner. So again, if the stress response is always turned on, then the propensity to breathe that way is going to also be turned on. So we see a lot of people who are stressed breathing from the mouth, breathing rapidly, and breathing from the chest, what we might refer to as dysfunctional breathing. So what we can do is use breathing as a tool or as a mechanism to help regulate the nervous system by breathing more functionally. So changing the breathing from mouth to nose, from short or shallow in the chest to deep and low, and then slowing the breathing down. The way I like to think about this is, if I am breathing really slowly, I'm intentionally changing my breathing. What this is telling my brain is that you are obviously in a very safe and secure place. Why? Well, because if you were being chased by the mountain lion, you wouldn't stop to change your breathing to low, slow, and deep, and from your nose. It would make no sense for you to do that. That would actually be very counterproductive, and probably going to end up in your life. So if you're doing this, the nervous system is therefore interpreting it, well, you're in a safe position. I'm going to allow you to relax. I'm going to set a cascade of physiological changes guided by your breathing to help the mind and the body to calm down. And so that is where breathing can be extremely valuable as a messenger to the body to slow down. It engages what we call the vagal brake, which is our 10th cranial nerve or our vagus nerve. It helps to uh, decrease the firing of neurons within the mind and body to help slow down, enhance the relaxation response. So I always tell people that a main strategy is to utilize this more functional breathing or breath work, we may call it, as a mechanism for training the nervous system more in the long term, but you also can do it more in the short term. So if we find ourselves in a really stressful situation or position, engaging in that type of breathing can be a great way to help reset the nervous system. So I'm a huge fan of, biofeedback, of functional breathwork training and functional breathing training. I just think that they're really great, fast, and efficient ways to affect change in the nervous system.
Yeah, I've seen that. I mean, that work in real time with some of the athletes that I coach. I coach baseball, so they make a throwing error, they walk a guy, they take a bad swing, like one big actual deep breath where they feel themselves taking a deep breath, in through the nose, in the belly, like you said, like you can just see them. Okay, it's okay. It's just one
Mm-hmm.
play. And they feel okay. And then the one error doesn't compound into 7 errors. It's just the one error. And then you move on. And then the next play, they're back in the zone. And so that's the only thing I can relate the sort of mountain lion attack to in sort of present day life, at least for me, working with athletes. But how do you relate nerves, anxiety, and stress? Are they're a bit different, or how do they relate, or what's your take there?
Yeah, a lot of the words are used fairly interchangeably for a lot of people. I don't care what verbiage people use to describe it. I can always relate it back to nervous system functioning because we know that whether it's clinically relevant anxiety, because a lot of times we think about stress as being kind of like the precursor to anxiety. So it's like the stress is an experience and it compounds. And as that compounds, then it can end up being in anxiety, which could be generalized to a lot of things. It might be more of a constant state of worry, kind of constant state being on edge. So they're all very much interrelated and correlated with one another. It might just be kind of the severity of the duration that we chat about, but I can always bring it back and relate it to nervous system functioning. Anxiety is just kind of more like an enhanced version of nervous system dysregulation. Maybe it's like the dial has been turned up a little bit higher. We're notching closer to 10, whereas stress might just be, again, a little bit more on off, and anxiety being a little bit more, it's just on. So I just always bring it back to then. But, again, people use different verbiage to describe kind of their experience. And, the word anxiety tends to be a little bit more clinical. And so a lot of people will stay away from using that word for them because they think, oh, that's more of kind of like someone who's experiencing like, something more significant, even though they may be really experiencing anxiety themselves. So I just always relate it back to, well, we all have times of nervous system regulation and we all have times of nervous system dysregulation. Just some people have a little bit more of a challenge than others do.
One of the things that I read in a book, I'm not sure where, but I like to remind myself and people of it, is that if your aim is to never feel stressed, then you have the goal of a dead person. So,
Right.
okay.
It's right. If you're human, you're going to experience stress. And I think that if the goal is for you to eliminate stress, you are going to be wildly disappointed that you're never going to accomplish that goal. Because, yeah, you're going to have to either be dead or, I think we're moving in the way of like pure AI for everything. So maybe you're just robotic now. You're just nothing but a microchip. So maybe you don't have any stress anymore.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No soul, no stress. Jeez.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but last one, huge, quality sleep. I mean, there's so much more about this now than I can even remember. But I think that's awesome. So yeah, quality sleep.
You can do everything for nutrition. You can do everything for exercise. You can even have really good stress mitigation skills in the moment, stress resiliency skills. But if sleep is dysregulated, you're going to be leaving a lot on the table and suffering way more than what you should. This is another one that I think we're finally coming to terms in our society that makes a lot of sense to get really good quality sleep. And this was kind of driven by like some of the top entrepreneurs. It used to be like the top entrepreneurs were like, I go to bed at like 12. I wake up at 3. I'm getting like 3 hours of sleep every night. I'm just crushing it. And then what starts happening? Well, these people start dying of heart attacks. Like they have strokes. Like things are not going well. And it was finally, kind of this wave of entrepreneurs who were like, maybe we're burning ourselves out a little bit too much by getting 3 hours a night of sleep. It's probably not good for our health, our relationships. Oh yeah, and our company and shareholders. So it was like in the world of entrepreneurs, they started saying, okay, well, what is the minimal dose effect here? Like, what do I need to get? And, it was recently, the studies and research that came out from like people like Matthew Walker, the book, Why We Sleep, and research out of, Stanford and Harvard that have indicated that like the core foundation of mental and physical health is high quality sleep. And if it is disregarded, then we see so much manifestation of mental and physical health related issues. And the data are so clear that it is one that is at this point in time, you can say is indisputable, a connection between sleep and physical and mental health problems. So I tell people, what we see in the literature is that getting a minimum of 7 hours of sleep, it's like the lower threshold, and then not sleeping over 10 hours. So we know that under 7 hours can actually, you can see signs of physical and mental impairment. And then over 10 hours actually is associated with poorer mental and physical health outcomes. We know that there's many individuals who have major depressive disorder who will sleep like all day long, and they'll sleep way longer than 10 hours. And again, we know that's not associated with really positive health outcomes, both mental and physical health outcomes. Sleep is the ultimate recovery catalyst. I mean, it is the thing that is going to help the nervous system to recover and repair and consolidate and get ready for the next day. Without high quality sleep, we know that we are setting ourselves up from a metabolic standpoint, from a mental health standpoint, for a not so great day. And as that compounds over time, as sleep gets worse and worse and worse and turns into something clinical like insomnia, we know that this starts turning into like impairing functioning, impairing cognitive functioning, impairing physical functioning. There are so many deleterious effects of poor sleep. So with the advent of a lot of the health technology out there for sleep tracking, I'm a huge advocate of monitoring sleep, whether it's, through, I've got an Aura ring on, or I've got an Aura, I've got a Whoop, I've got my Apple Watch on as well. And then my Hanu. So I track everything because I'm a data
I've got the Aura
nerd.
ring. Yeah.
Yeah. It's great. And the good thing
is.
about it is that you can look to see, like, am I waking up really often throughout night? Like, am I getting enough deep sleep, enough REM sleep, which are really important for mental and physical health? Am I sleeping long enough? Like, that's the key. And it will help kind of provide and drive that insight. And I think it's a good motivator and accountability partner, because the one thing is, like, you can wake up in the morning and you can kind of bullshit yourself into saying like, yeah, I got enough sleep, I'm good to go. But if you're not quantifying it, then maybe you just you're kind of just spewing, all this bullshit to yourself. So I like the idea of being able to check in subjectively with your energy level in the morning. Do I feel recovered? Do I feel rested? But also looking at that data and saying, yeah, okay, well, I got my whatever minimum of 7 hours. Like I got like a really good high portion of deep and REM sleep. The nervous system's really well repaired and recovered to go in. And if not, like there's a lot of strategies that we can use to help better our sleep overall. But I think it's like kind of, if I was going to put anything at like the bottom of the pyramid, like the foundational portion of the pyramid of health and wellness, I think sleep is where what I'd put on the bottom there.
Yeah, I mean, it has to be it, right? Because if you don't have any energy, then you can't do anything. If I have no energy, then I definitely don't have clarity of mind to pick the nutritious food. I'm going to pick what's easy and most convenient, which is normally the thing that's not so good, unless I've pre-planned ahead of time, which I haven't because I haven't slept very well and I have no energy. If I have
Right.
no energy, I'm not going to go to the gym because I have no energy.
Yep.
And
Exactly.
if stress happens and things happen in my life and someone cuts me off at work, my boss yells at me, I'm late, I'm not going to be able to handle those things well because, again, I have no energy.
Mm.
And so it's taken a long time, for this to happen. Because when I was a young athlete, it was always like, hey, grind, 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 grind. No one told me about sleep. My
Yep.
parents said I needed to go to bed, and that made sense, so I could sleep and wake up refreshed. But there was no culture around it. And now
Right.
I listen to Dr. Michael Gervais a lot, and he's a big proponent of this. He's like, yes, we can work hard, but that's sort of a prerequisite. The most important thing we want to do is recover hard. You
That's
have to
right.
recover hard,
Yeah.
because then each and every day you can get to the edge of your capacity. You get to the edge of your capacity, you recover just as hard. And now you have this sort of thing where you can show up every day like that. And that made the most sense to me. And also this idea of energy management versus time management. Oh, I want to manage my energy then
Yep.
more over my time, because then I can maximize my time with that if I'm bringing my best energy to each and every day. And so those things made more sense to me, and that's why I got the Aura ring and started tracking my sleep and things like that. But
Yeah. 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 It's got to be a foundational thing that people work on. You're going to leave so much on the table if you do not recognize that it is, the core skill for mental and physical health.
funny story about when I initially got my Aura ring. Um, when I got it, and I'm a pretty competitive guy. And so I got it and I was like, okay, I got to get a really good score. I got to get a really good score. And for like the first
Right.
week, I didn't sleep at all because every time I went to bed, I was like, all right, here's where I'm going to get an 85. I'm gonna get a 90. 2 hours
Yeah.
later, I'm like wide awake. It's like 1 o'clock in the morning. My alarm goes off. I'm like, shit.
Right.
So,
It's a bummer. You
um,
tried to gamify it, but it just like it was counter to what you were looking for.
yeah. So then it was like, just the ring is there. Just do what you normally do. And
That's
then
it.
I figured it out a little bit, and now I've had it for a couple years and it's cool. But
Nice.
yeah.
Love it.
So yeah, those are the 4 pillars of basically not just mental health, but like living your best life
Yep.
in the most healthy way possible and trying to be proactive with that. I think that's a huge thing when it comes to this stuff. Like, I think our society is a little bit, let's only figure it out when we're in the crisis.
That's it.
And so I
That's
think,
it. All right. It's the way we see, I was having a conversation with a physician about this. This is kind of the way that conventional medicine is set up, right? Like you go run a blood panel, and it's only if it gets flagged that we need to work out something. So it's only if there's potential pathology or an actual diagnosis that's okay. Now let's intervene. But if your blood markers are right there next to it, and it looks like if you continue down the same path, it's going to be into the pathology place. But no, you're sub-threshold, then you're okay. We don't even need to have the talk. Oh, your blood pressure is 129 over 79. Well, you're 1 milligram away from being there into hypertensive, but you're not there yet. So we'll have that conversation once you reach pathology. That's kind of how modern day medicine is, and it's really sad because it's like, well, what can we do as a prophylactic? Like, what can we do to step in and intervene earlier so that we don't get to that point? Like, why do we need to diagnose and start treating somebody for high blood glucose, when their HbA1c is 6.570? Why can't we start doing it like when they're like 5.8, 5.9? It's just a weird thing that I think we're changing a little bit with precision medicine, but we haven't really gotten there just yet.
yeah, is that what your business is trying to do and the services you offer, right? Trying to be proactive?
Yeah, proactive in the mental health space. So for us, what we're trying to do is say we want to be an early detection, an early radar for you. So when we see signs that your nervous system is starting to unravel, starting to dysregulate, there's signs that the stress response is about to explode, the A bomb's about to go off. We want to intervene early so that you can become aware that that's going on, but also learn how to self-regulate in the moment. And it's precision mental health care in the sense that we're looking at metrics as it relates to you. We understand and we filter everything through a lens of you because we have enough data to understand with our algorithms where you typically are. And when we see you shift dynamically away from there, That's what we're going to alert you and let you know, hey, something's going on. Let's go ahead and take the opportunity to regulate the nervous system before things spiral down. Because we want to do what we can to prevent a panic attack, not intervene when the panic attack is happening. Because when the panic attack is happening, it's a lot more difficult to intervene. But if we can catch the early signs of it before it turns into a panic attack, well, that's going to be really, really good for many, many reasons. But for especially that individual who's dealing with a panic attack, because if they can intervene early, then they know that they're going to be able to prevent going to the hospital, spending a bunch of money. Like, there's an embarrassment associated with a lot of people who have panic attacks, especially like if they find themselves in the ER and they're like, sorry, it's just a mental health thing. Like, that's embarrassing for a lot of people to experience. So we want to intervene as early as we can.
Yeah. Yeah. And encouraging people to know that the investment they make early in their mental health will always be beneficial. Always.
Yes. Yep.
No matter what.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because, for a long time, anytime people heard mental health, they always just went directly to, oh, that person's crazy. That person's super depressed. And that's just not what mental health is. Mental health, for me, I think about it like how you think, feel, and act. And so every single person who's living on this planet has mental health. Now, as you know, obviously being the doctor, there's mental health conditions, which are totally different. Your schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, stuff like that. Totally different sphere, needs totally different treatment and help. But just for everyone who's living life, there's so many proactive mental skills that you can learn right now, even as a young person, like 6th, 7th, 8th grade, and start learning and implementing so that when the inevitable hard thing happens in your life, because we all get knocked down and punched in the face, you're like, oh, okay, this is where I apply my protocols and I become this person who can do these things on a day-to-day basis. And I know how to handle this stuff. And okay, this is a stressful situation I'm about to present in front of my class. Okay, I can take a couple deep breaths. I have a mantra. Here we go. Let's rock it. All that stuff. Yeah. It's like, instead of just like throwing people out into the world and being like, figure it out.
Right.
What? I don't know what to do.
Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of people think too that they almost have this idea that you go from like not anxious to anxious or like not depressed to depressed. It's typically not that simple. A lot of these things are very progressive. It starts off kind of small and then it blooms and builds and builds and builds and builds. And we actually even see this with severe and persistent mental illness. So things like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. What we see is that these individuals will start having kind of like small manifestations of symptoms. And it can be due to a lot of different things kind of in their internal, external environment, but that kind of builds and builds and builds and builds and builds until, there's either a kind of like a seminal event or, whatever it may be. And so I like to tell people, it's like, if we can intervene early before it gets to the point of hospitalization or, even something worse than that, then that's the key. Like, that's the key is early intervention, early detection, or early prevention. And so we all know that our nervous system over time, if we don't teach it how to regulate itself, it becomes more and more dysregulated. And that can then ultimately or eventually lead to some of these more clinical conditions. And so we're all about, like, even if you don't see yourself as having, quote unquote, clinical mental health related symptoms or disorders, you most certainly have a manifestation of stress in your life. And so this can be a great thing to help prevent your nervous system from unraveling and heading down a path that eventually could be more clinical one day.
Yeah. Fantastic. All right. I got one more question to ask you.
Sure.
Because I can't not ask it, because it's from my favorite podcaster, Tim Ferriss, and his book is right behind you, Tools of Titans.
That's right.
And so if you've ever listened to his podcast, you might know the question I'm about to ask. But anyways, Dr. J, if you were going to put up a billboard and millions of people were going to see that billboard, what would you put on it?
Yeah, I've thought about this, and I have a couple of responses that go through my head every single time I think about this one. But I'm gonna share like what I think is the one that I truly would put on there. And the billboard would just simply say, "You are loved." I think that so many people live life thinking that they are unlovable, that they're defective, that they are disposable. And I would say that for me, even if you feel like you are not loved, I believe that you are. And it may not be by yourself right now. It may not even be by others around you in your community, but I think collectively you're loved. And maybe it's by, the universe or your maker or however you like to phrase it. I think that everybody is loved by somebody, and just knowing that you are loved is enough for me, at least, to motivate me to want to continue to be here and help others and be with others in community. So I like the billboard, "You are loved."
When you first said that, I almost started to cry because I own and run a mental health nonprofit called You Are Loved.
No, I did not know that.
Yeah, and I assumed you didn't, because just it felt so organic and real when you said it. Yeah, I started it in 2019 because in 2018 I lost my big sister Rachel to suicide, and so those three words, man, like came to me when I really fucking needed them, like really needed them, and it's sometimes it sounds cheesy, but to me it's like it's so true. It's like, yeah. So I don't really have any more words to say because you just dropped that on me, and so that's beautiful, man.
Yeah. No, it's I mean, I honestly had no idea, and I'm very, very sorry for your loss, and can only imagine what it was like to go through something like that. I can't even imagine what it's like to go through that. But man, for that to be impressed upon your heart and your soul, I mean, that's those words. That's phenomenal. It's cool.
Yeah. It's another reason for these great conversations.
Yeah.
So, well, Dr. J, I appreciate your time. I loved it. I loved every second of it. And thank you for all the work you do and everything you put out into the universe.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Aaron, for having me on.
What's up, everybody? Thank you for tuning into that episode. And if you enjoyed it, click here for another full-length episode of the podcast. And please don't forget to subscribe. But above all else, most importantly, please take good care of yourselves and others. And I'll see you next time. Lots of love. Cheers.